She was 22 and had just been thrown out. No warning, no second chances, just a box of her things on the front porch and a note taped to the door that said, "Don't come back." And with one $10 bill, she bought an abandoned blacksmith shop in a forgotten corner of rural Pennsylvania. The forge was cold. The anvil had been sitting under a tarp since the 1970s. The township said the building wasn't worth the cost to tear it down. But what nobody knew was that hidden behind the old forge, in a space that had been sealed shut for over 50 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ruth Galloway came from a family that made things with their hands. Her grandfather had been a welder at the Bethlehem Steel Plant in eastern Pennsylvania from 1952 until the plant closed in 1995. Her father, Jack Galloway, had been a pipe fitter until a back injury forced him onto disability when Ruth was 15. Her uncle on her mother's side had been a tool and die maker. The Galloway family was the kind of family where you learned what tools were called before you learned how to read, and where a Saturday afternoon spent sharpening a chainsaw counted as quality time. Ruth took to it naturally. She was the kind of child who preferred the garage to the living room. When her father was still working, she would spend hours in the corner of his workshop, handing him wrenches, watching him fit pipes together, asking questions about threads and joints, and why some connections had to be tight and others had to be loose. He had answered her patiently. Jack Galloway was not a man who used many words, but when he did speak, he spoke carefully, and he never treated Ruth's questions as silly. Her mother was a different story. Linda Galloway had always wanted a different kind of daughter. A daughter who was interested in clothes and hair and friends and boys. A daughter who would go to prom and get married in a white dress and give her grandchildren to hold. Ruth had none of those interests. Ruth was more comfortable holding a crescent wrench than a bouquet. Ruth wore her hair back and her clothes practical and had strong forearms from carrying things that other girls her age didn't know how to carry. Linda loved her daughter, but she never quite knew what to do with her. And her way of not knowing expressed itself as a slow, steady disappointment that Ruth had been trying to ignore for most of her life. After Jack's injury, the Galloway household became a tense place. Jack was in pain. Linda was angry about the pain and the money and the fact that her husband was home all day. Ruth was caught in the middle, trying to help where she could, trying to stay out of the way where she couldn't. She got a job at 16 at a small metal fabrication shop outside of Allentown, where the owner, a man named Dutch, who had known her grandfather, took her on as an apprentice and taught her to weld. She came home with her forearms freckled with burn marks and her mother sighing and her father nodding with a quiet approval that meant more than anything Linda could have said. Ruth worked at the fabrication shop for 6 years. She learned MIG welding, TIG welding, stick welding, plasma cutting, sheet metal work, and basic machining. She learned how to read blueprints and how to set up a layout for a production run. She learned how to do precision work that required her to hold her hand steady for long minutes at a time, which was a skill she had been developing since she was small, and her father had shown her how to hold a match near a soldering iron without flinching. Her father died when Ruth was 21. Heart attack. The doctors said it was probably related to the medications he had been on for the back pain, though they couldn't say for sure. Jack Galloway was 54 years old. The funeral was small. Ruth wore a black dress that didn't fit her properly and carried her grandfather's old welding gloves in her purse because she wanted something of her family with her that felt real. After the funeral, things with Linda got worse. Her mother's grief expressed itself as anger at anyone who was still alive, and since Ruth was the only person still in the house, Ruth caught most of it. The anger was rarely direct. It came out as complaints about the dishes Ruth had left in the sink, about the boots Ruth had tracked through the kitchen, about the hours Ruth kept, about the fact that Ruth spent every weekend at Dutch's shop instead of trying to meet people her own age. Linda did not want to grieve her husband, and so she had decided, without ever saying it out loud, to blame her daughter for all the ways her life had not turned out the way she wanted. One Saturday morning in March, about 10 months after Jack's death, Linda Ruth came home from a shift at Dutch's shop and found a cardboard box on the front porch. Inside the box were her welding gloves, her work boots, her laptop, her notebook of blueprints, and the few pieces of clothing she actually wore. Taped to the front door of the house was a note in Linda's handwriting. It read, "Ruth, I need you to find somewhere else to live. I can't do this anymore. Don't come back." Mom. Ruth read the note twice. Then she tried the front door. It was locked. She tried the back door. Also locked. She looked at the box. She looked at the note. She looked at the house where she had lived for 22 years. And then, without crying, without yelling, without knocking on the door or calling through the window, she picked up the box and walked to the bus stop at the end of the street. She had seen this coming for months, if she was honest with herself. Her mother had been building up to it since the funeral. The only thing Ruth hadn't known was the date. She had $83 in her bank account and $40 in cash in her wallet. She called Dutch from the bus stop. Dutch was 68 years old, widowed, and lived alone in a small house behind the fabrication shop. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Come here. We'll figure it out." Ruth lived in Dutch's spare room for 3 months. Dutch refused to let her pay rent. He said he had been paid enough by her family over the years, meaning her grandfather and her father and the cousins and uncles who had come through his shop, and that if Ruth wanted to work off her stay, she could stay at the shop later in the evenings and help him with the backlog. Ruth did that gladly. She worked 12-hour days at the shop and came home to Dutch's kitchen at night and ate dinner with him while he read the newspaper and commented on the world. It was the kindest 3 months of her life. But Ruth knew she couldn't stay forever. Dutch was a good man, but he was also getting old, and he didn't need a 22-year-old roommate for the rest of his days. She started looking for somewhere of her own to live. An apartment was out of the question. She couldn't afford first month's rent and a security deposit on her wages. She looked at cheap houses in the rougher parts of Allentown and couldn't afford those either. Then, one evening in June, sitting at Dutch's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her laptop, she typed "cheapest property in Pennsylvania" into a search engine just to see what came up. The third result was a county surplus auction page. The county was a place called Snyder County, about 2 hours west of Allentown, in the Susquehanna River Valley. The page listed a property that had been on the auction rolls for over a decade, a small building on a half-acre parcel located off a gravel road in a township called Port Trevorton. The building was described in the listing as historic blacksmith shop, approximately 600 square feet, wood frame with brick chimney. The property had been vacant since 1971. The current asking price was $10. Ruth stared at the listing for a long time. A blacksmith shop. She had never worked a forge. She knew welding, which was modern blacksmithing in most practical senses. She knew how to shape metal with heat. She knew how to work with tongs and hammers and anvils, though her anvils had always been small benchtop models for delicate work, not the big floor anvils that traditional blacksmiths used. But the idea of a blacksmith shop, a place with a real coal forge and a real anvil and real tools meant for real work, caught at her the way certain ideas catch at people who recognize something essential to themselves in the idea. The way a person who has always loved the sea might catch at the idea of living beside it. She showed the listing to Dutch that night. Dutch read it carefully, tapped his finger on the screen and said, "Snyder County. I know that country. It's quiet, farms, river, good people. Not a lot of work out there, but if you've got your own shop, you don't need to find work. The work finds you." "I don't know how to be a blacksmith, Dutch." He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "Ruth, you've been welding for 6 years. You know metal. You know heat. You know tools. The only thing you don't know is coal instead of gas, and you can learn that in a week. A blacksmith is a person who makes things with their hands. You've been making things with your hands since you were 4 years old." That was true. Ruth hadn't thought of it that way. She took the bus to Port Trevorton the next Saturday. It took almost 4 hours. The bus let her off at a gas station at the edge of town, and she walked the last 3 miles to the county office in Middleburg, carrying her work bag and a thermos of coffee and a packet of peanut butter crackers Dutch had pressed into her hand before she left. The county office was in an old stone courthouse on a small town square with a war memorial and a flagpole, and an ancient oak tree that the plaque said was planted in 1854. The clerk was a woman in her 50s named Grace, with reading glasses on a chain and a framed photograph of 3 grandchildren on her desk. She pulled up the listing on her computer, looked at Ruth, and said, "The old Detweiler smithy? Honey, nobody's opened that building in over 50 years. Ruth set a $10 bill on the counter. "I understand, ma'am. I'd still like to claim it." Grace studied her face, not the way the county clerks in previous stories had studied the young women who came to them, with pity or skepticism or a kind of exhausted concern. Grace studied Ruth with a specific attention, as if she were evaluating whether Ruth was telling the truth about something important. "You know anything about blacksmithing?" "I know welding. 6 years professional, I can learn." Grace nodded slowly. "My father was a blacksmith in Middleburg, back in the 50s, before the work ran out. He always said a smithy was a good place for a person who knew what they were doing. The building makes its own case, he used to say. You show up, you light the fire, you start working. The building tells you what it needs." She started filling out the paperwork. The walk from Middleburg to the blacksmith shop was about 6 miles, partly along a county road and partly along a gravel track that wound through cornfields and hayfields and stands of oak and maple. Ruth walked the whole distance with her work bag slung over her shoulder and her rucksack on her back, and she thought about what Grace had said. The building makes its own case. You show up, you light the fire, you start working. It was the first time in months that she had felt something like hope. She found the shop at the end of the gravel track, in a small clearing surrounded by bare winter trees. The building was exactly what the photo had shown, maybe a little rougher. Weathered, dark brown board and batten siding. A steep pitched shingle roof that was missing shingles in a few places but was otherwise sound. A large central sliding barn door on an iron track. The door hanging crooked because one of the track rollers had broken. A tall brick chimney on the right side of the building, darkened by decades of coal smoke, the bricks still solid. 2 small windows with iron bars flanking the door. An anvil-shaped wooden sign hanging crooked above the door by a single rusted chain. Old horseshoes and rusted iron tools scattered in the weeds around the foundation. Ruth stood in the gravel track for a long moment and looked at the building. It was beautiful in a way that only working buildings are beautiful. Utilitarian, honest, shaped entirely by the work that had happened inside it. This was not a house pretending to be a workshop. It was a workshop, pure and whole, the kind of building that knew exactly what it was for. She walked to the sliding door and pushed it. The crooked track protested, but the door moved. She slid it open, far enough to step inside. The interior was a single large room. The floor was hard-packed earth, stained black in places where coal dust and iron filings had worked into the soil over decades. The walls were the same dark wood as the outside, with hooks and pegs mounted along them for tools. Most of the hooks were empty, but a few still held things: a pair of long-handled tongs, a leather apron stiff with age, a broken hammerhead missing its handle. In the center of the room was the forge. It was a traditional brick forge about 4 feet square and 3 feet tall, with a cast-iron firepot in the center and a wooden handle attached to a bellows that had been rigged to feed air underneath the firepot. The firepot was full of ash and old coal clinkers. The bellows looked desiccated but still attached. The brick sides of the forge were blackened with soot but otherwise intact. Beside the forge stood the anvil. It was massive. Ruth estimated 200 pounds, maybe more. Mounted on a stump of oak that had been cut flat to level it. The face of the anvil was scarred with decades of hammer marks, but the working surface was still clean. Someone had covered it with a piece of canvas before leaving, and the canvas had kept most of the rust off. When Ruth lifted the canvas and touched the anvil surface, the metal was cold and hard and alive, in the way that good anvils are, which is to say, it rang faintly when she tapped it with a fingernail, even after 50 years of sitting untouched. There were other tools, too. A post vise mounted to one of the support beams, a slack tub for quenching, mostly rusted but still functional, a swage block on a stand in the corner, a small hardy tool still sitting on top of the anvil, forgotten, waiting for the next person to come along and start a job. Ruth walked slowly through the shop, taking it all in. The building smelled faintly of old coal and old iron, and the particular sweetness that charred wood gets after it has been burning at high temperatures for years. It was a smell Ruth knew from her grandfather's welding shop and from the corners of Dutch's fabrication business. It was a smell that meant work had happened here. Real work, the kind that required heat and patience and strength. She stood in front of the forge and put her hand on the cold brick. And she thought, almost without knowing she was thinking it, I can work here. I can make a life in this room. Then she noticed something. Behind the forge, between the back of the forge and the rear wall of the shop, there was a gap. Most forges in small shops were built close to the back wall to save space, with maybe 6 inches of clearance for ventilation and access. But this forge had been built with almost 3 feet of space behind it. That was unusual. Ruth walked around the forge and examined the gap. The rear wall of the shop back there was made of the same board and batten siding as the rest of the walls, but the boards in that section were darker than the rest, as if they had been stained differently or aged differently. She touched them. They were solid. But when she ran her hand along the seam where the boards met the floor, she felt a slight gap, a seam that wasn't supposed to be there. Ruth knelt down and pressed on the boards from the floor upward. Near the middle of the wall, about 4 feet off the ground, one of the boards moved slightly under her hand. She pushed harder. The board, and the 2 boards on either side of it, swung inward together. A hidden door, a concealed panel in the rear wall, held in place by friction and a small wooden catch she could now see on the inside. Behind the hidden panel was a small storage compartment, maybe 3 feet deep running the width of the 3 concealed boards. Inside the compartment, stacked against the back of the shop's outer wall, were wooden crates. Ruth pulled the first crate out. It was heavy. She set it on the forge and lifted the lid. Inside were hand tools, blacksmithing tools, hammers of every weight and shape, their heads forged and their hickory handles smooth with use. Tongs, flat tongs, scrolling tongs, box jaw tongs, wolf jaw tongs, dozens of them, each one made by hand. Files, punches, chisels. A small collection of tool steel billets that had never been used, still wrapped in oilcloth. Ruth's breath caught. These were not just tools. These were master tools. The kind of tools that a working blacksmith would have accumulated over a lifetime and treasured and cared for. She could tell by the weight and balance of each hammer in her hand that they had been forged by someone who knew what they were doing, by another blacksmith. Probably by the same blacksmith who had used them. Blacksmiths often made their own tools, and the tools they made for themselves were often the finest work they ever did, because the tools had to serve them for years. She pulled out the second crate. More tools. The third. This one held smaller items, stamps, punches, small forming tools, a set of chisels in a wooden box lined with felt. The fourth crate held books. Old books, some of them very old. Blacksmithing manuals from the 19th century. A handwritten notebook in pencil and pen, the pages filled with drawings of tools and processes and measurements, and the kind of careful notes that a craftsman keeps when he is teaching himself his trade. And at the bottom of the fourth crate, beneath the books, was a small leather pouch and a sealed envelope. Ruth opened the pouch first. Inside were gold coins. Small gold coins, old ones, the kind used as currency in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She counted them. 38 gold pieces, most of them American eagles and half-eagles from the 1890s to the 1920s. She had no idea exactly what they were worth, but she knew that individual gold coins of that age and type were worth many times their face value. Hundreds of dollars each. Some thousands. She opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on heavy cream-colored paper, the ink brown with age. To whoever finds this, my name is Reuben Detweiler. I have been the blacksmith in Port Trevorton since 1924. My father was the blacksmith before me from 1898 to 1924. Together, we have worked this forge for nearly 70 years. I am writing this letter in the summer of 1971, knowing that I will soon close this shop for the last time. My hands are no longer strong enough for the work. I have no children. The trade is dying in this country. Most of what a blacksmith used to do is now done in factories. There is no one to leave this shop to. I have hidden my best tools behind the forge, in a compartment my father built for this exact purpose. He told me once that you should never leave good tools for the auction. Good tools should go to someone who understands them. I have hidden them with that belief. The gold coins are from my father's savings. He did not trust banks after 1933. He kept his savings in gold, in a small pouch under the floorboards of our house. When he died, he left them to me. I have not needed them. I leave them now for whoever finds these tools. If you are the person who finds this compartment, I trust you are the kind of person who still cares about making things with your hands. You have earned these tools. You have earned the coins that come with them. Take them all, with my blessing. But I ask one thing of you. Relight the forge, even just once. Let this shop know that someone came for it. A forge that has been cold for 50 years remembers every fire that ever burned in it, and it waits for the next one. I have been hearing that waiting my whole life. I could not give the forge what it wanted at the end. I hope you can. Reuben Detweiler, August 1971. Ruth read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and sat down on an overturned crate in the middle of the shop with the gold coins in her lap and the hidden compartment open behind her. And for a long moment she did not move. The afternoon sun was slanting through the dusty windows, cutting through the air in pale bars that fell across the anvil, and the forge and the tools scattered on the floor around her. She was going to relight the forge. That was not in question. The question was how soon, and what she would make first, and whether she deserved the gift that had been left for her. But she would relight it. She owed it to Reuben Detweiler. She owed it to the hands that had forged these tools. She owed it to the building itself, which had been waiting for 50 years to hear the sound of a hammer on hot iron again. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what's a skill your family passed down to you that still lives in your hands? Ruth spent the first night sleeping on the floor of the shop in her sleeping bag, between the forge and the anvil. She did not relight the forge that first night. She wanted to prepare it properly first. She wanted to be ready. The next morning, she walked back into Middleburg and went to a hardware store and bought a bag of blacksmithing coal. The store owner, an older man who looked at her with curiosity when she asked for coal, said, "You bought the old Detweiler place, didn't you? Grace told me." News traveled fast in small towns. Ruth said yes. The store owner refused to charge her for the coal. "Reuben was a good man," he said. "You're doing something right if you're lighting his forge again." Ruth walked back to the shop with the bag of coal on her shoulder. She cleaned out the fire pot, laid a small fire of kindling in the first coals, and used a wooden match to light it. The bellows creaked, but still worked. Air blew into the fire pot from underneath. The fire caught. She added more coal, slowly, watching the flames climb and settle. Within 20 minutes, The forge was burning hot, and black smoke was rising up through the brick chimney for the first time in 50 years. Ruth stood in front of the burning forge with Reuben's leather apron on, the one she had found hanging on the wall, stiff with age, which had softened slightly as she wore it. And she held one of Reuben's hammers in her right hand and one of Reuben's tongs in her left. And she picked up a small piece of mild steel bar stock from the crates, and she laid it across the anvil, and she took her first strike. The hammer rang against the hot steel on the anvil face, and the sound of it filled the shop. A clean, bright ringing that traveled up through the roof beams and out into the winter trees and across the fields and down toward the river. The sound of a blacksmith shop that had come back to life. She was crying, but she didn't stop working. Over the next year, Ruth rebuilt her life around the forge. She sold 8 of the gold coins through a reputable dealer in Philadelphia for just over $24,000, enough money to live on for a while and to make the repairs the shop needed. She kept the other 30 coins as an emergency fund, tucked into the same leather pouch that Reuben had left them in, hidden now in a new place she had chosen. The hidden tools and the books she kept entirely. They were worth more to her than any money. The hammers in particular were the best tools she had ever held. She would use them every working day of her life. She repaired the building itself slowly, over several months. New shingles on the roof, new rollers on the sliding door track, glass in the windows, a small loft built into one corner where she could sleep, with a wood stove for heat and a camp kitchen for cooking. She lived simply. The shop was her home and her workplace and her life, and she did not need much beyond it. And she worked the forge. She taught herself traditional blacksmithing from Reuben's notebook and from books she ordered online, and from videos she watched in the evenings by lamplight. She made mistakes. She burned pieces of steel that she had heated past the point of working. She forged hooks that came out crooked and had to be scrapped. She split the handle of one of Reuben's hammers by striking it wrong and had to hand-carve a new one from hickory. She learned slowly, patiently, the way her grandfather had learned to weld, and her father had learned to pipe fit, and Reuben had learned to smith before her. Within 6 months, she was making things worth selling. Garden tools, hand-forged, fireplace sets, hooks and hangers, and simple hardware. She set up a small booth at a craft fair in Selinsgrove and sold everything she brought in the first hour. Word got around. People started finding their way to the old Detweiler smithy to commission work from the young woman who had reopened it. A farmer wanted a custom gate hinge. A bride wanted hand-forged wedding rings for her wedding. A writer from a regional magazine came out to interview Ruth for an article about the return of traditional crafts to rural Pennsylvania. The article ran in the magazine's fall issue. It included a photograph of Ruth standing beside the anvil with Reuben's leather apron on and a hammer in her hand. The headline read, "The Last Blacksmith of Snyder County." Ruth wrote a letter to the editor asking them to change it to "The Next Blacksmith of Snyder County," and the editor did. Dutch came to visit her in the fall. He drove up from Allentown in his old pickup truck and spent a weekend at the shop, watching her work and asking questions and running his hands over Reuben's tools with the appreciation of a craftsman for the work of another craftsman. When he left, he gave her a small wooden box he had made himself. Inside the box was a hammer. Her grandfather's hammer, the one he had used at the Bethlehem steel plant for 40 years. Dutch had kept it in a drawer after her grandfather's retirement, hoping someday to give it to someone who would use it. Ruth added the hammer to Reuben's collection on the wall of the shop. 3 generations of hands that had worked metal, all hanging together, waiting for her to pick them up and use them. One evening in late October, Ruth sat on a stool in front of the cooling forge and watched the last orange coals fade to gray. The shop was quiet. Outside, the sun had set behind the bare winter trees and the first stars were appearing over the Susquehanna Valley. A small fire in her wood stove in the loft made the whole building warm. The tools hung on their hooks, ready for the next day. The anvil rang faintly when she tapped it with her fingernail. the same ring it had made the day she first touched it. Except now the sound felt different. Now it felt like it belonged to her. She thought about Reuben de Twyler, a man she had never met, who had worked this forge for 47 years and had hidden his best tools behind the back wall of his own shop because he had trusted that someday someone would find them. Someone who still cared about making things with their hands. Reuben had been right to trust. Ruth cared. She cared more than she could put into words, and in a way that surprised her sometimes when she thought about it, because she had not come to Port Trevorton looking for a tradition. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, and the tradition had found her anyway. Or, maybe more accurately, the tradition had been waiting for her, and she had walked into its waiting without knowing what she was walking into. She thought about her mother, Linda, who had taped a note to the front door that said, "Don't come back." And she thought for the first time that her mother had done her a kindness, not on purpose. Linda had not meant to send her daughter into a new life. Linda had just meant to get her daughter out of the house, because Linda couldn't stand the sight of the girl who reminded her of the husband she had lost. But sometimes the doors other people close are the doors that force us forward. Sometimes being thrown out is the same thing as being pushed toward something better. She thought about her father, Jack, who had taught her how to hold a wrench and ask good questions and stay patient with broken things. She thought about her grandfather, whose hammer now hung on the wall of her shop. She thought about Dutch, who had given her a spare room and a coal budget and a new life when her old life had ended. And she thought about this thing that had happened, this impossible gift that had been waiting for her inside a hidden compartment behind an old forge in a forgotten township in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. That's the thing about work that gets passed down. It doesn't disappear when the person who did it stops. It waits. It sits in toolboxes and hidden compartments and dusty corners of old workshops, in the ring of an anvil that hasn't been struck in 50 years, in the balance of a hammer that fits only a certain kind of hand. It waits for the next hand that can hold it. And when that hand arrives, the way Ruth Galloway's hand had arrived, 22 years old and thrown out and with nowhere else to go, the work recognizes the hand, and the hand recognizes the work. And the old fire comes back to life the way old fires do, which is to say, not as a memory, but as a beginning. A beginning that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, for exactly the right person to walk in and strike the match. Ruth Galloway was 22 years old and thrown out. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a blacksmith shop in a forgotten corner of rural Pennsylvania. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, is there a craft or skill you wish you had learned from someone in your family? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.